I'd flown hundreds of miles, carrying my special Christmas gifts, only to stand outside my daughter's front door and hear their laughter, saying they wished I'd never come. That pain, that betrayal, changed everything. And so I began to unleash a storm of my own. What happened next would change their lives forever. They'd never forget it. My flight to Austin, Texas had been long, but a comfortable one. The in-flight movie had been a pleasant distraction, but my mind was on the quiet suburb waiting for me. I'd been looking forward to this trip, to spending Christmas with my daughter Sarah and her husband Mike. I'd spent countless hours picking out their presents. A rare first edition art book for Mike, whose paintings never seemed to sell, and a beautiful cashmere sweater for Sarah. I wanted them to know how much I loved them, how much I cared. This was my life now, after all. Since my retirement, my time and money were for them. The drive from the airport was uneventful. Austin was uncharacteristically cold, and a light, freezing rain had begun to fall. The holiday lights on the houses were blurred through my windshield. Finally, I turned onto their street. Their house glowed warmly against the December gloom, the Christmas lights on the porch sparkling red and gold. I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through my chest, chasing away the chill. I reached for the doorbell, but my hand stopped in midair. Voices drifted through the thin door, Sarah's laugh mixing with Mike's deeper rumble. My heart swelled. They were home, safe and sound, probably wondering where their old man was. I'd flown through a storm to be here. My old aches and pains be damned. Nothing would keep me from Christmas with my daughter. I honestly hope he doesn't make it. Sarah's voice cut through my thoughts like ice. My hand froze. The cold seeped through my coat, settling deep in my chest. "Come on, that's your dad," Mike replied, but his tone held amusement, not reproach. I know. But look at this weather. Maybe his flight will be too bad. We could have one Christmas without him hovering, bringing those boring gifts." Sarah's laugh again. Lighter now, just the two of them. Just us. No guilt trips about family togetherness. Mike agreed. The old man does lay it on thick, always talking about his sacrifices. I'd been standing there maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. The Christmas music playing inside suddenly sounded mocking. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah. "Drive safe if you're coming, Dad. Weather looks rough." I stared at the screen, then at the warm windows where their shadows moved behind drawn curtains. She'd sent this while laughing about hoping I wouldn't make it. The gifts in my suitcase suddenly felt like mockeries. All my love, all my sacrifices, all my effort was reduced to a joke, a burden. I stepped back from the door, my shoes crunching on the wet pavement. The sound seemed deafeningly loud, but their laughter continued uninterrupted. I walked slowly to my rental car, my heart heavy with a coldness I had never felt before. I wasn't heading home. Not yet. I had nowhere to be. No one was counting on me. No one was hoping I'd stay away. For the first time in years, I had a new, terrible clarity. My mind, once a simple tool for building a life, now felt sharp, strategic, and calculating. This wasn't an emotion to be suffered. This was a problem to be solved. And I had all the time in the world to plan. Frank drove home through the quiet streets, his mind no longer on the disappointment of Christmas, but on the cold, hard reality of what he'd just heard. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a name he hadn't called in years, a man he'd once trusted with all his legal affairs. David Wilson, estate planning specialist. Frank knew what he had to do. He had spent 15 years building his life around Sarah, but now it was time to build a life for himself again, one that no longer revolved around their needs. The next morning, Frank woke up to the silence he'd come to appreciate. No excited calls from Sarah, no hurried plans for gift exchanges. He sat with his coffee, his mind replaying the conversation he'd heard outside their door. He had a plan, one that would teach them a lesson about consequences and entitlement. He picked up his phone and called David Wilson, his voice steady and calm. "David, I need to make some changes to my will," he said. "I want to change the primary beneficiary." David was surprised. "Frank, this is a significant change. Are you sure?" "I've never been more certain," Frank replied. "I'm designating the Great Lakes Animal Welfare Foundation as my primary beneficiary instead of Sarah." He explained that he'd been thinking about loyalty and who truly deserved his support. Animals don't lie to you, he said. They don't hope you won't show up for important occasions. They appreciate care when it's given. Frank also began to fabricate a story, one that would explain his sudden change in behavior and provide a reason for his distance. He called Sarah and put on an act. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I had an accident on my way to you. Nothing serious, but the doctors wanted to keep me overnight for observation. I didn't want to ruin your Christmas Eve." Sarah's voice carried a note of concern, but Frank could hear the rehearsed quality underneath. "Oh my goodness," she exclaimed. "Why didn't you call us? We could have come to the hospital." But she never offered to come over, just asked about the car. It was the perfect test, and they had failed it completely. Their relief was palpable when he suggested rescheduling Christmas dinner for next week. With his will changed, and his story in place, Frank felt a sense of control he hadn't experienced in years. The documents he'd prepared with David were proof that he was no longer a victim of his own generosity. Sarah would continue to receive her monthly allowance for now, but she was completely unaware that her future had just evaporated. The will was just the beginning. The practical lessons and consequences were about to begin. Frank spent the next week meticulously reviewing every financial connection between Sarah and himself, mapping out 15 years of dependency she'd taken completely for granted. He drove to his bank with a folder of account documents. The same bank where he'd opened Sarah's college fund years ago, where he'd co-signed her first checking account, and where he'd arranged the automatic monthly transfers that had become her financial lifeline. "Good morning, Mr. Green," Janet, his personal banker, greeted him warmly. "How can I help you today?" "I need to close the joint checking account with my daughter and cancel all automatic transfers," he said, placing the paperwork on her desk. "Also, I'd like to change the beneficiaries on my insurance policies." Janet's eyebrows rose slightly, but she remained professional. "Of course, sir. May I ask if there's been any family situation that's prompted this?" Frank's lie came easily now. "Just updating my affairs after some recent health concerns. I want to ensure my assets go where they'll be most appreciated." On Friday afternoon, while Sarah was likely planning her weekend shopping trip, the changes took effect. The monthly transfer of $3,000, the transfer she'd relied on for rent, groceries, and Mike's art supplies, simply wouldn't arrive this time. Saturday morning brought the first test. Frank was having coffee, picturing Sarah at the grocery store, her cart full of organic produce and expensive cuts of meat, confidently sliding her card at the checkout as she had for years. The call came at exactly 2:17 p.m. "Dad!" Ashley's voice carried confusion and embarrassment. "My card was declined at the store. There must be some mistake with the bank." Frank let the call go to voicemail. A third message arrived an hour later. He could hear Mike's voice in the background, muffled but distinct. "Tell him we can't pay rent next week if this isn't fixed." Frank turned his phone off and went to his study, feeling a grim satisfaction. By evening, Sarah had left 7 messages, the progression of her voice, a fascinating descent from confusion to barely controlled panic. Mike's voice grew more prominent, shifting from annoyance to accusation. "Ashley, this is your fault somehow," he could hear him say. "You must have said something to set him off." By Sunday, paranoia had fully blossomed. "Ernest, if you're listening to this, we know you're behind this somehow." Mike's voice dominated the latest message. "You're trying to destroy us." Even Sarah sounded uncertain now. The evolution was perfect. From confusion to panic, to suspicion, to the beginning of understanding. Financial pressure was just the beginning. Now came the consequences for years of cutting corners, a lesson Frank intended to teach Mike with surgical precision. Frank had spent 3 years watching Mike sell his paintings at weekend markets, always for cash, always with that smug smile that said he was smarter than the system. On a Tuesday morning, Frank drove to the public library downtown. He chose a computer in a quiet corner, drawn to its complete anonymity. He needed no login, no tracking cookies, just clean access to official websites. The IRS whistleblower office page loaded with bureaucratic efficiency, offering forms for reporting tax fraud and undeclared income. The anonymous tip submission was simple. Frank typed in the details. Mike's name and address, the unreported cash income from art sales at the local farmers markets. He even provided specific dates he'd seen Mike working the markets, always returning home with thick envelopes of cash that never appeared on any tax return. The estimated annual unreported income was between $15,000 and $20,000. A few days later, Frank moved on to the second phase of his plan. From the same anonymous computer, he updated Sarah and Mike's creditors about their changed financial circumstances. He used professional, clinical language, no longer supported by a family member, recent loss of co-signer support, updated risk assessment recommended. The language was devastatingly effective. He drove past their house that evening, slowly and carefully, like any other neighbor. Mike's car was in the driveway, and he could see Sarah's silhouette pacing past the living room window. The body language was unmistakable, crisis mode activated. Friday morning brought the confirmation he'd been waiting for. A new voicemail from Sarah arrived at 7:23 a.m., her voice thin and strained. "Dad, something terrible is happening. The IRS wants to audit Mike's taxes. They're asking about unreported income, and the credit card companies are demanding payment in full. Please call me back. We need help." Frank smiled grimly. He could hear Mike's voice rumbling in the background. "Tell him this started right after he cut us off." That's not a coincidence. Their first spark of awareness. It was perfect. The next voicemail, 3 hours later, carried a different tone. "Dad, we drove to your house, but you didn't answer. Your car was there. Are you avoiding us?" Mike thinks someone is targeting us specifically. The beautiful irony was not lost on Frank. They were finally beginning to grasp the scope of their situation. Frank's campaign against Sarah and Mike moved from financial pressure to social ruin, a lesson about how quickly a community can turn against you when the right information reaches the right people. He spent weeks observing Sarah's social networks, her salon colleagues, her neighborhood book club, and the weekend farmers market where Mike peddled his amateur paintings. He started at the public library again, creating anonymous email accounts with carefully chosen names like Patricia Concerned Neighbor and Business Watch. Each profile required a different computer session and a different voice. He sent the first wave of emails to Sarah's workplace, a concerned client writing to salon management. "I'm worried about Sarah's personal situation affecting her work quality," the email read. "She seems distracted lately, and there are rumors about financial troubles. Just thought you should know." The language was professional, caring, and devastating. By the weekend, the neighborhood phase began. Frank posted anonymous messages to the local Facebook group. "Has anyone else noticed all the official mail going to the Wilson house? Hope they're not having the kind of problems that affect property values." Within hours, neighbors were speculating, remembering unusual details, and noting how their car had been repossessed last month. The consequences began to manifest with surgical precision. Sarah's manager pulled her aside to discuss her future with the salon, citing clients' concerns about her personal situation. Mike was asked to take a break from selling at the farmers market. Sarah's isolation was complete. She left a voicemail for Frank, her voice thin and strained. "Dad, no one will talk to me. The grocery store cashier was cold. The mailman won't make eye contact. This isn't natural social dynamics. This is deliberate destruction." The breaking point arrived with Mike's voice dominating a new message, filled with anger and desperation. "Frank, this is coordinated. Someone is spreading information about us systematically. Sarah lost her job today, and the farmers market coordinator asked me to take a break." He finally understood that their destruction was intentional. The final message Frank received from Sarah's voicemail was hollow and defeated. "Dad, I know you can hear these messages." Mike's packing his things. He says, "I'm toxic now. I have no income, no friends, no support system. Whatever lesson you're teaching, I'm learning it. Please call me back." Then Mike's angry voice cut in. "Frank, you win. We're powerless without you. If you want to talk terms, we're ready to listen." They finally understood this was a negotiation, not a tantrum. Frank felt only a cold satisfaction. A month of careful planning had led to this moment. Through my living room window, I could see Sarah's face, pale and desperate. She looked nothing like the confident woman who'd laughed about hoping I wouldn't show up for Christmas. They sat in their car for several minutes, arguing. Mike gestured angrily while Sarah stared at my house with something approaching horror. Finally, they got out and approached my front door with the grim determination of people who had nothing left to lose. I answered before they could knock. "Dad." Sarah's voice cracked on the single word. Behind her, Mike looked older, defeated, like a man who'd discovered his easy life had hidden costs. "Sarah, Mike," I said, stepping aside to let them in, noting how they moved. Sarah was hesitant, while Mike was aggressive but uncertain. "I wasn't expecting you," I said calmly. "Weren't you?" Mike's voice carried barely controlled fury. "Everything started falling apart right after Christmas, right after you supposedly had your accident." His eyes narrowed. "Funny thing is, your car's been in the driveway every time we've driven by." I met his stare calmly. "I've been recovering. Doctor's orders to rest." "What doctor? What hospital?" Sarah's voice was thin and desperate. "We called everywhere Christmas Day trying to find you." Nobody had any record of Frank Green being admitted. The moment stretched between us. I could have maintained the fiction, but I chose to let the silence speak for itself. "You were never in an accident," Sarah whispered. "You've been here the whole time, haven't you?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Mike stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. "You've been watching us fall apart, enjoying it." "I've been observing," I said carefully. "That's different." "Observing what?" Sarah's voice rose. "Our bank accounts being closed, my job being destroyed, Mike's tax problems, the whole neighborhood turning against us. You think that's all coincidence?" "Interesting theory," I said, settling into my favorite chair, forcing them to remain standing. The power dynamic was exactly where I wanted it. "What makes you think any of that has anything to do with me?" Sarah's eyes searched my face, looking for something. Guilt, anger, satisfaction. What she found made her take a step backward. "The timing," she said slowly. "Everything started right after Christmas." Her voice trailed off as understanding began to dawn. Mike looked between us, sensing currents he couldn't quite grasp. "Right after what?" he demanded. But Sarah wasn't looking at him anymore. She was staring at me with growing horror, understanding spreading across her face like a stain. "You heard us talking," she whispered. "That's why you left. That's why everything started falling apart." The recognition in her eyes was everything I'd worked toward for a month. Not just understanding that her life had been systematically destroyed, but knowing why. Knowing that her own words, her own cruelty, had set everything in motion. "You heard what we said about you," Sarah continued, her voice barely audible. "About hoping you wouldn't make it through the snow. About your guilt trips and your—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Mike, finally understanding enough to be afraid, looked at her. "Sarah, what did you say?" But Sarah wasn't looking at him anymore. She was staring at me with growing horror, the truth spreading across her face like a stain. "You heard us talking," she whispered again, and I said nothing. Sometimes silence speaks louder than any words. I watched them scramble like insects in a jar, unaware that the lid had been sealed weeks ago. "You were never in an accident," Sarah said, the realization hitting her again. I remained perfectly still, letting her work it out for herself. "You've been here the whole time, haven't you?" I let the silence speak for itself. "You've been watching us fall apart, enjoying it." "I've been observing," I corrected carefully. "That's different." She finally comprehended the full scope of her situation. It wasn't just that her life had been systematically destroyed. It was knowing why. Knowing that her own cruel words had set everything in motion. Everything that's happened since that night. Your financial problems, the social isolation, the job loss, Mike leaving. All of it started because I finally understood what you really thought of me, I said, my voice steady despite the rage building inside. "Those were just words," she cried, desperate sobs shaking her whole body. "People say things they don't mean when they're stressed." "And you revealed your true feelings about your father," I finished. "The man who sacrificed everything for you, who built his entire life around your happiness, who flew through a storm because he thought you wanted him here." Sarah was crying now, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "Please," she whispered. "Please, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." But I wasn't finished with her education yet. "Forgiveness has to be earned," I said carefully. "How?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Tell me how, and I'll do it." I looked at her, standing on my doorstep, homeless, abandoned, isolated, desperate, and felt no sympathy whatsoever. That's something you'll have to figure out yourself, I said, and closed the door. The next morning would bring her the final, unexpected lesson. 6 months had passed since that final confrontation with Sarah. My life had found a new rhythm, a tranquility I never thought possible. The emptiness I felt after Ellen's passing was no longer a heavy presence. Now, instead of sitting alone in my large house, my mind was busy with meaningful things. The Great Lakes Animal Welfare Foundation had become not only the recipient of my inheritance, but also my purpose. 3 mornings a week I volunteered at their shelter, feeding the dogs, cleaning their kennels, and spending time with them. The wagging tails and trusting licks were expressions of love that didn't need to be bought or demanded. One Tuesday afternoon, as I stood in my kitchen brewing coffee, a letter arrived. I immediately recognized Sarah's handwriting, though it was now more mature and steady than the desperate scrawl I remembered from her previous attempts to contact me. My heart gave a gentle flutter, not from anger or hurt, but from a mild curiosity. I opened the letter, standing there, watching my coffee grow cold on the counter. "Dear Dad," the letter began, "I don't expect you to reply to this. I'm not asking for anything. Not money, not forgiveness, not reconciliation. I just wanted you to know how these past 6 months have changed me. I'm working at a grocery store now, on my feet 40 hours a week. It's hard work, dealing with difficult customers and cleaning up spills. But for the first time in my life, I understand what you meant when you talked about earning something. Every paycheck feels different when I've worked for it, instead of just receiving it. I live in a small apartment that I pay for myself. It's not much, but it's mine. Mike never came back from Cleveland, and honestly, I'm glad. I needed to learn who I am when I'm not depending on someone else's generosity," she continued, revealing that she knew about the new will. "My lawyer told me when I tried to contest it last spring. He explained that you had changed everything in January, before all of this started. I understand now that even when I thought I had a safety net, I didn't. You were teaching me to fly without me even knowing it. I'm not the same woman who laughed about hoping you wouldn't make it to Christmas. That person feels like a stranger to me now. I know I can never take back those words, or the years of taking your love for granted. I just wanted you to know that your lesson worked. I learned." I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in my desk drawer. I felt no urge to respond, no desire for reconciliation. The lesson had been taught and learned. That was enough. That afternoon, I drove to the shelter for my regular volunteer shift. The dogs now knew my car, and I could hear their excited barking as I pulled into the parking lot. A German Shepherd mix named Charlie, too old and scarred to attract adopters, laid his massive head across my lap with complete trust when I sat down to rest. His tail thumped against the concrete floor with pure contentment. This was a form of love not tied to inheritance or money. He simply appreciated kindness when it was offered. I had started the paperwork to adopt Charlie the week before. At 63, I was finally ready to share my home with someone who understood loyalty. As I drove home, I thought about Sarah's letter one last time. She had learned the value of work, the dignity of independence. My methods had been harsh, but the lesson had taken hold. Sometimes, people needed to lose everything to discover what they were truly capable of. I had no regrets about the choices I'd made that Christmas Eve, or any day since. Justice wasn't always gentle, but it was always fair.